Welcome back to School for Relationships. This video today is a super important one for me, and it's really only going to make sense if you've seen the What is Codependency video. So start there just to make sure you've got our definition down, and then come back. And what we're here to talk about in this video is how codependency plays out in culture at large. We're putting our systems thinking hats on. So systems thinking looks at not just what something is and how it works, but what is the larger context that this thing's a part of, and how are we affected by that context? So speaking of context, I want to start with a disclaimer and acknowledge I am a white American therapist, and I'm working exclusively with clients who are living in the US. So if you're taking some of this information and thinking about how to apply it outside of the US to different cultures, I'd really want to make sure that we're bringing in some modifications and some nuance to make the information more culturally relevant and appropriate. And I have had conversations about codependency with clients coming from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, clients who've experienced immigration or whose family has, including Native clients as well. So I think we've got a lot of material for some really rich and juicy conversations with those modifications. So for you, if you're listening to this video and trying to think about how to apply this to your own cultural context, let me know. I'd really encourage you to share any thoughts, questions, or concerns that you may have, so that I can also learn from you just as you're learning from me in this process. So what we're looking at again is codependency as a relationship where we have one person or group over assuming responsibility and the other person or group under assuming responsibility. And when we look at codependency in that way, kind of over functioning, under functioning, I look around and I start to see this as a very widespread cultural phenomenon. And again, not all codependent relationships are bad. They can be helpful or even necessary in some contexts and for some periods of time. But long term, we are looking at a price tag because what we're really talking about with codependency is imbalanced relationships. So the codependent behavior that drives imbalances in relationships, funny enough, I believe actually comes from a positive impulse that exists within humans. And that is this drive that we have to maintain balance and harmony within our social systems. So internal family systems in particular and other systems thinking looks at ways that the system will kind of self-right or balance itself out when it senses instability or more like extremes that are causing it to fluctuate. And I think this drive to maintain balance, especially social balance, again just comes from the fact that we are so hardwired to be social as humans. Our nervous system, how it regulates so much of our optimal physical and mental health comes from engaging in collaborative social interactions. And so of course we have this deep-seated and innate desire to connect, but we have to be careful with that we are not prioritizing short-term harmony and conflict reduction in how we're connecting to people, so that long-term we don't lose sight of what is mutually supportive, safe, fulfilling, and we really want to look at that long-term health of the relationship. So when we take this drive to maintain balance in social systems, and then we look at our current status quo, which is an imbalance in our social systems, a lot of inequity that's existed for generations, this is where that positive impulse turns more problematic. And again, we're looking at this desire to maintain balance and harmony turning into a mechanism that can actually maintain our system's existing inequity and imbalances. And so just to break this down a little bit, within a culture and society with so many imbalanced relationships across different types of power, privilege, and oppression, if we have a desire for harmony and balance, long term especially, we are running the risk that that desire turns into something that's maintaining the status quo, maintaining a sense of familiarity, avoiding conflict, and potentially avoiding or moving us away from necessary and helpful social change. And again, we're going to look at this more in depth, but what we're looking at in this video is how inequity plays out across social groups with different levels of power and privilege or oppression and discrimination. And the general trend that I see is that marginalized and oppressed social groups bear a lot more responsibility, even just to survive, due to their historical oppression. And then we can look at the privileges of the dominant social group as ways that this group is able to assume less social responsibility and receive the same or even more social benefits. And I'm included in this. There's a lot of aspects of my identity that bring me a lot of privilege and allow me to assume less responsibility for the same or more benefits. And when we take then marginalized social groups, we're again looking at a burden of higher levels of responsibility, and this brings more strain, more drain, and it's coming with less benefits and less fulfillment from the responsibility and work that these social groups are engaged in. And so in general, when you see some groups are given some responsibilities, others less or more, we start to see a society where people are really being grouped and kind of reduced to narrow and fixed roles based on certain identity characteristics. We can be looking at race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. It could be immigration status, first language, all these different aspects of our identity that determine the level of privilege and oppression that we're accorded in our society. And these identity characteristics assign us to very rigid roles because this is something most of the time we're born into, we don't have a choice over, and we can't change. And again, these rigid roles are further dividing people from each other and leading to this really kind of divided and polarized society that we live in today. And within the rigid roles and groups that people are assigned to, we also see pre-assigned levels of responsibility and rights. And so much of how social worth is given and viewed in mainstream society is really dependent on how well we perform our assigned social roles. So we've got this general trend, and we can see this across a lot of different aspects of identity that are either marginalized or that come with more powers, more privilege. That being said, of course, with the general trend, we want to keep some nuance here and really look at each individual's experience as unique because, hey, just for starters, identity is intersectional. One person can have aspects of their identity that bring them more privileges and also other aspects that cause them to face more discrimination. And we can also see from our last video on, family roots of codependency that we could have children growing up with the same identity characteristics in the same home, but if they're experiencing, different upbringing, different treatment, the way they respond and cope to stressors is also going to be different across their lives. So we're looking at this like large scale abstract pattern. We're trying to keep some nuance as a part of this. I want to try to make this more concrete. Let's bring it down to earth. And I'm going to give one specific example to try to really kind of drive in and make tangible what we're talking about here. Within the scope of this video, unfortunately, I cannot do justice to all of the different examples that we see of marginalized social groups having to overassume responsibility and privileged social groups having to underassume responsibility. But this is one of those spaces where I'd love to hear from you. You know, anything you want to add and comment for this conversation about what stands out to you the most from your own experiences. How do you relate this to different aspects of your own identity? So for the example I'll be using, I actually have one of my clients to thank for this. This was a conversation where we were diving into codependency, how this plays out for them. And this client asked me, hey, how does race fit into this? So what I want to talk about in particular is actually the experience of a lot of Black Americans living in the US. So I'm going to just get focused in and specific here on that. And we're going to be looking at just a few of the different ways that Black Americans have had to overassume responsibility to receive the same level of rights and opportunities and to be treated with the same level of respect as their white peers. So we see, coming out of slavery and then the Jim Crow era, this tremendous pressure that Black American families were under to want to move from slavery into freedom, from surviving into thriving. And we see, upward social mobility where more Black Americans are trying to move from poverty and into the middle or upper class. And we also see some families just trying to stay in the middle class, to maintain what they have. And even from the research we have out there, even the experience of being a Black American trying to stay in the middle class, there are so many additional barriers and challenges and stressors that Black Americans are under, not just to get to the middle class, but to stay there once they're there compared to other racial groups, especially white Americans. We're looking at two very different experiences here. And, one very specific example of how this can play out is a trend that we've seen that for a Black person to be given the same level of opportunity as their white peer, there's been this pressure to be the smartest and best and most outstanding person in the room, or you could say in like an applicant pool, just to have a chance at that same opportunity. So that's one specific example. I also want to talk about a different type of overfunctioning that more has to do with over-communicating and over-regulating of Black people's emotions. And when we see within American society different levels of white fragility, we have this trend of a lot of white Americans viewing an open expression of Black emotion as a threat. And so that's putting Black Americans also under this pressure to overfunction in terms of emotional labor and emotional responsibility. And this is something I didn't address as explicitly in our first video, but one of the biggest ways that codependency plays out, or that imbalanced relationships play out, is actually in how emotional responsibility is divided in a relationship. And this is where we see, with inequitable division of responsibility, some of the greatest costs of these imbalanced relationships. And we're looking at costs of prolonged stress, which can lead to burnout and eventually reduced functioning. So just to make it really clear, like emotional labor, emotional responsibility, what I mean here is the work of managing and communicating the emotions of everyone involved in a relationship. So we can see, again, bringing it back to our example, more responsibility that Black Americans have had on their shoulders to over manage and communicate their own emotions so as not to be seen as a threat by white Americans. And these are just a few specific examples of the tremendous amount of pressure that Black Americans and other marginalized groups have been under for generations to overfunction. Again, especially in terms of this like emotional labor, emotional responsibility. And not only this, but we see a lot of Black families and parents who feel obligated to pass down these levels of overfunctioning and hypervigilance to their kids for their kids' own safety and survival. So when we look at such high levels of chronic strain, we see some people figure out ways to manage, figure out ways to get by. Other people within these marginalized groups may experience so much chronic overwhelm and lack of safety that this can lead to underfunctioning. And this can make it feel much harder for people to consistently take care of themselves and their own needs. And especially for social groups facing marginalization, discrimination, oppression, we can really see some of the most common mental health symptoms in such a different light. Especially talking about depression and anxiety, these are often treated as pathological. And what I see when we look again at this tremendous amount of pressure to overfunction is these symptoms are actually like a natural and protective warning system that exists within our bodies, where we've got these messages and cues coming up of saying, hey, whoa, you got to stop and slow down. Your own needs are being neglected, at least the need for rest, and our bodies are letting us know we can't keep going on like this forever. And each of us need to find some time and space to be able to honor our own capacity and limits. Finding ways to at least reduce some of the stress load that we are carrying on our shoulders. So lastly, I want to close. When we're talking about chronic stress, chronic imbalances in relationships, even chronic or complex trauma, what we cannot leave out of this conversation is resilience. No matter what adversity people may experience, we are each so resilient, and we have this capacity within us to reconnect to this resilience no matter what happens to us. And when I say resilient, what I am meaning here is a capacity that we have to access coping skills and resources that help us take care of ourselves, that help enhance and improve our well-being. And accessing these resources, these can be internal resources, something within each of us that we're accessing, and external resources and supports that help us connect to well-being. And what the research shows us on resilience is what really builds resilience is beneficial experiences that connect us to more positive feelings about ourselves. And these beneficial experiences don't have to be life-changing. These can be very small and mundane. We're talking any time that we get to experience a positive connection or interaction with someone that inspires a sense of trust. Anytime we get to be nurtured and taken care of in a way that feels safe for us. Maybe we're feeling connected to a sense of community. We might also feel more connected to ourselves in some of these little experiences, because let's say we've maybe just worked our way through a challenge where we felt stuck before. So in these little moments, we're developing this resilience that protects us from some of the negative effects of stress and other health problems. So we've got resilience as this amazing protective factor, and also as something that we can continue to grow and build throughout our lifetime, which we'll be talking about a lot more in a video coming up on how to build self-worth. So I want to close with this final question. I've given a very clinical definition of what resilience means, and I'd love to hear from you. What does resilience mean, feel, and look like for you in your own lived experience? As you share some of this, please stay tuned in. Our next video will finally be getting into how to heal from codependency. So you got a lot more good stuff coming. Subscribe to this channel and stay posted. And thanks for joining us today for our systems thinking and cultural analysis of codependency.